Hello everyone, I am very glad that you're joining this story. Subscribe, like and comment. Enjoy the story, smile more often.
You shouldn't expect much from the will, Claire. You're just a teacher, not a real success like your brother. That was the last thing my father said to me before we stepped into the lawyer's office, and I swear it landed with all the weight of a backhand, dressed up in civility and condescension. I stood there, blinking for a second, trying to decide whether I should laugh, scream, or simply nod and save my fire for another day. In the end, I chose silence. Not because I agreed with him, not because I didn't have anything to say, but because I knew there was more to come, and for once, I wanted him to sit in his own ignorance without my commentary. He didn't deserve my words, not anymore. I'm Claire Reynolds, 39 years old, a middle school English teacher in a town that most people fly over without noticing. I've taught Shakespeare to sixth graders, calmed sobbing teenagers through heartbreaks and panic attacks, rewritten lesson plans at midnight, and graded essays with coffee-stained fingers at my kitchen table while the world around me slept. I don't drive a luxury car. I don't have stock portfolios or a corner office with a view of the skyline. But I have students who've told me I changed their lives. I have classrooms full of worn-out desks and kids who look to me like I'm a lighthouse when their lives feel like storms. Still, in my father's eyes, none of that has ever mattered. My brother, Eric, now there's a name that makes everyone in the family straighten their posture and drop into rehearsed admiration. Eric with his tailored suits, his smug grin, and his constant stream of financial jargon that makes him sound important, even when he's just repeating the same buzzwords from some TED Talk. He's 10 months younger than me, but has always been treated like the eldest, like the rightful heir to our father's pride, our family name, and, apparently, now, the estate. Ever since we were kids, it's been the same script. Eric got the bigger bedroom, the first car, the louder applause at every holiday gathering. When I won a scholarship, my father nodded politely. When Eric got a C- on an economics midterm, our dad called it potential in disguise. I was the steady one, the quiet achiever, the girl who read novels instead of chasing trophies. And for that, I was endlessly overlooked. Our grandfather, Henry Reynolds, was the only person in the entire family who ever made me feel seen without strings attached. He was this soft-spoken man with weathered hands and a mind sharper than most people half his age. He'd sit with me on the porch during summers, ask me about my students, my lesson plans, my favorite authors. He didn't care that I didn't wear designer shoes or brag about annual bonuses. He cared about stories, about how people moved through the world, quietly doing good without applause. When he passed away last month, something inside me cracked in a way I hadn't expected. It wasn't just grief, it was a deeper ache, a fear that the one person who ever saw me for who I was had vanished, leaving me alone in a family that measured worth in decimal points and job titles. And so, when my father made that comment, when he brushed me off with that damn smirk that always made my blood boil, I should have been angry. I should have thrown it back in his face. But instead, I remembered something strange, something that had been lodged in the back of my mind for weeks now. It was a conversation I'd had with my grandfather not long before he died. We were sitting under that old maple tree in his backyard, the one that drops leaves the size of your face every October, and he looked at me with this peculiar glint in his eyes, almost like he was about to tell me a secret but wasn't sure if I was ready for it yet. He said, "You know, Claire, sometimes the things that last aren't the loudest ones. Sometimes what you build in silence speaks loudest after you're gone." I remember laughing a little, brushing it off like one of his poetic musings, something cryptic but harmless. But now, standing outside the lawyer's office with my father's words still ringing in my ears, I wondered if that moment had meant something more. I wondered if my grandfather had known something back then, something none of us were prepared for. And for the first time in a very long time, I let myself hope that maybe, just maybe, all those years of being invisible had not been in vain. I glanced at Eric, already swaggering ahead like he owned the outcome, and I smiled quietly to myself. Because what my grandfather did before he died might just change everything. There's a strange kind of hush that settles over a lawyer's office when a family gathers for a will reading, like everyone is afraid to breathe too loudly in case it disrupts the inevitable disappointment or unexpected windfall. The air was thick with formality that morning, crisp suits and stiff backs, cheap perfume blending with expensive cologne, and the underlying scent of tension that no candle or coffee could mask. We sat in a conference room that looked like it hadn't changed since 1985, dark wood paneling, heavy leather chairs, and a single clock ticking far too loudly for the size of the room. I took my seat near the corner, letting the others settle into their places like chess pieces ready for a game they assumed would go exactly according to plan. My father, of course, was in full performance mode, legs crossed confidently, arms draped casually across the chair, as if he were about to conduct a board meeting instead of grieve the man who raised him. He glanced toward the door repeatedly, waiting for the attorney to appear, and every time his eyes drifted back toward me, he offered that same smug smile I'd grown up dreading. The kind of smile that said he knew something you didn't and couldn't wait to tell you. Well, he muttered just loud enough for everyone to hear, I imagine Eric will be a busy man after today, managing all that land and stock. Grandfather was a traditionalist. He'd want things in competent hands. He didn't look at me when he said it, but he didn't have to. The implication hung in the air like smoke from a cheap cigar. Some things didn't need to be said outright when you've spent a lifetime saying them in whispers and glances. Eric chuckled, brushing an invisible speck of dust from his sleeve, as if the entire reading was already a formality, a rubber stamp on a destiny he believed had always belonged to him. I stared at the table, keeping my face still, but inside I was burning, not just from the arrogance in his voice, but from the deep, aching familiarity of this routine. I'd been underestimated for so long by these people that even my silence was seen as weakness, as confirmation that I accepted my place at the bottom of the family's invisible hierarchy. But what they didn't understand, what they never even bothered to consider, was that I hadn't come here hoping for scraps. I'd come because something in my gut told me this day wouldn't end the way they thought it would. And maybe that made me foolish, maybe even naive, but I'd learned long ago to trust that quiet pull beneath the surface, the same one that had led me into a classroom instead of a corner office, the same one that had taught me value doesn't always show up in a paycheck or a portfolio. As we waited, my thoughts drifted to my grandfather, not the man defined by his estate or reputation, but the version of him only I seemed to know. The one who used to sneak lemon drops into my coat pocket before church. The one who came to my classroom once, just once, without announcing it, and sat in the back for an entire lesson about To Kill a Mockingbird, nodding along with the students' ideas like he was one of them. He didn't say much afterward, just handed me a note that said, "You teach better than most people ever learn to lead." I kept that note in my desk drawer, hidden beneath piles of essays and old lesson plans, and I read it on the days I felt invisible. That was the man I was mourning, not the patriarch, not the property owner, but the grandfather who saw me not as someone who fell short of ambition, but as someone who lived on her own terms, quietly and with purpose. And maybe, just maybe, he had left behind more than anyone expected. When the attorney finally entered, carrying a heavy folder that seemed to groan under the weight of formality, the room straightened collectively, like students awaiting exam results. He greeted us briefly, opened the file, and began to read, his voice measured, rehearsed, devoid of emotion. The estate was divided in typical fashion at first. My father received a small vineyard property, a few investment holdings. Eric was granted the family home, some shares in a tech startup grandfather had once backed, and a sizable trust. Everything was going exactly as expected. The same old script. The same golden boy narrative. But something in the phrasing caught my attention, a small, legal phrase buried between clauses, something about a reserved designation for non-disclosed assets, something so subtle that no one else even flinched when it passed the attorney's lips. I leaned forward slightly, not enough to draw attention, but enough to mark it in my mind. Because I'd spent years reading between the lines, in essays, in parent emails, in administrative memos, and I knew the difference between filler and foreshadowing. And then, right on cue, the attorney paused. He looked up at the room, clearing his throat gently, and then flipped to the last page. "And now," he said, adjusting his glasses, "the final addendum. This portion was added just 3 days before Mr. Reynolds passed away." The room shifted all at once. Chairs squeaked, my father's brow furrowed. Eric sat up straighter. Everyone sensed the change in tone, but no one knew what was coming. Except maybe me. Because I remembered that conversation under the maple tree. I remembered the look in my grandfather's eyes. And suddenly, I wasn't just a teacher sitting quietly in the corner anymore. I was the storm they never saw coming. The lawyer adjusted his glasses, took a slow breath, and let the silence stretch just long enough for the anticipation to settle in everyone's bones before he began reading the final addendum. His voice steady, but carrying the weight of something none of us had expected. "Prior to my passing, I made arrangements that were not disclosed to the family in previous documentation," he started, his eyes flicking briefly in my direction before continuing, his tone even but undeniably deliberate. "Several years ago, I privately sold a substantial portion of land, a section of the original estate that had remained unaccounted for in recent appraisals, the details of which were deliberately omitted from formal records. The net earnings from the sale, totaling $2,375,000, have been placed into a secured trust fund under the sole name of my granddaughter, Claire Reynolds." For a moment, it felt as if the entire room had stopped breathing, like the very air had thickened into something impenetrable, suffocating, and unmovable. I could hear the faintest creak of leather as my father tensed in his chair, the barely restrained exhale of disbelief from my brother, the slow, almost mechanical way the lawyer turned the page, as if giving everyone just a few more seconds to fully absorb what had just been spoken aloud. I wasn't sure what stunned me more, the fact that my grandfather had done this in absolute secrecy, or the fact that, for once in my life, my name was attached to something no one could take away from me. The lawyer continued reading, his voice unwavering even as the energy in the room shifted from quiet anticipation to something far more unstable, something almost volatile. "It is my firm belief that Claire has demonstrated the kind of integrity, resilience, and purpose that is rarely rewarded in traditional inheritances, and for that reason, I have entrusted her with this gift. She has chosen a life not built on entitlement, not dictated by the weight of expectation, but instead crafted by her own sense of dedication, compassion, and perseverance. I refuse to see such values go unrecognized." I felt a lump rise in my throat, an unexpected heat burning behind my eyes, but I forced myself to keep my expression neutral, knowing that the second I showed any reaction, my father would weaponize it. Eric would turn it into ammunition, and this moment, this rare, impossible moment, would become something I could never reclaim. Instead, I pressed my hands against my lap, fingers gripping the fabric of my dress, and inhaled through my nose, letting the words settle, letting them root themselves inside of me like something permanent, something no one could strip away. Eric's chair scraped back against the floor, the sharp sound cutting through the silence like a blade, his hands gripping the arms of the chair so tightly his knuckles had turned white. "This is a joke," he said, his voice thin with disbelief, his gaze darting between the lawyer and our father, searching for confirmation that this was some kind of clerical mistake. Some glitch in the universe that would be corrected the moment someone with real authority stepped in. That money should have been part of the estate division. There's no way he would have done this without telling anyone. The lawyer barely blinked, his professionalism a steel wall against Eric's brewing outrage, his expression unreadable as he calmly flipped the page and responded without hesitation. "I assure you, the sale of the land was executed legally, through private channels, with all necessary documentation signed and verified well before Mr. Reynolds's passing. It was his express wish that this transaction remain undisclosed until now." My father finally spoke, his voice a low, controlled growl, the kind he used when he was trying to restrain something ugly beneath the surface. "This doesn't make sense," he muttered, shaking his head slightly, his eyes narrowing as if he could somehow see through the lawyer's words, as if there had to be some hidden deception buried within the documents in front of him. Why would he give her that kind of money and not tell the family? Not tell me. And there it was, the real question. Not why my grandfather had done it, not what it meant for me, but why my father had been excluded, why his control had been bypassed entirely. Why the one person in this family he had spent his entire life dismissing had become the sole beneficiary of something he now realized he couldn't touch. I could have answered that question. I could have looked him in the eye and told him exactly why my grandfather had chosen me, why he had kept this hidden, why he had decided that the only way to ensure his legacy didn't become just another number in Eric's investment portfolio or another bargaining chip in my father's empire was to make sure it went somewhere it would never be squandered. But I didn't. Because this wasn't a moment for explanations, for justifications, for trying to make them understand something they were never meant to. Instead, I sat in my silence, letting the weight of their realization crush them, letting the quiet stretch long enough for them to feel it in their bones. And then the lawyer reached into the file, pulled out a second envelope, and placed it carefully on the table in front of me. It was smaller than the others, sealed with my grandfather's initials, and had only 6 words scrawled across the front in his familiar, steady handwriting. Do not open until the first storm passes. I traced my fingers over the ink, feeling the weight of what had just happened, knowing that whatever was inside this envelope would not just be an explanation, but a revelation, something meant to be understood only when the dust had settled. When the first battle had been fought, when the war had fully begun. And as I lifted my eyes to meet my father's, as I watched Eric's disbelief harden into something darker, something venomous, something that told me he wasn't going to let this go without a fight, I realized something I hadn't before. My grandfather hadn't just given me an inheritance. He had given me a weapon. And now, whether I wanted it or not, the battle had begun. I knew the backlash was coming the second that final page had been read, even before Eric's chair had finished screeching backward across the polished floor, and before my father's scowl hardened into something colder than disappointment. But what I hadn't anticipated, what I couldn't have fully prepared myself for, was just how quickly the golden sun unraveled, how fast his carefully curated image of composure and control fractured the moment the spotlight didn't land on him. His face turned a shade of red I hadn't seen since we were teenagers, the kind of red that usually came right before a tantrum or a door slam, and his voice cracked in disbelief as he pushed himself out of his chair, pointing at me like I had pulled some sleight of hand and tricked a dead man into favoring me. She manipulated him, Eric hissed, glaring at the lawyer like he was a co-conspirator in some twisted scheme I'd orchestrated. She spent years planting ideas in his head, playing the innocent granddaughter card while pretending she didn't care about money. His words came fast and sharp, laced with accusation and wounded pride, and it was clear that the sting of being passed over wasn't just about the money, it was about the legacy, about the public humiliation of not being the chosen one anymore. My father leaned forward in his chair, his jaw clenched tight enough to splinter bone, and for a moment, I thought he might try to keep some shred of dignity in front of the lawyer. But instead, he nodded slowly and said, "We'll contest this. We'll drag it into court if we have to. That kind of addendum won't hold up under scrutiny. Your grandfather wasn't in his right mind toward the end, and Claire took advantage of that." I sat still, staring at them both with a kind of quiet disbelief, not because I was surprised by their reaction, but because the speed with which they turned this into a courtroom drama was almost laughable. My father, who had always prided himself on dignity and restraint, was now clinging to whatever legal technicalities he could find to strip me of something that wasn't even his to begin with. And Eric was unraveling so fast I half expected him to start tearing the room apart in search of some hidden clause that would restore his precious title as heir apparent. But I didn't flinch. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't try to defend myself or plead my case or point to the letter now tucked safely in my coat pocket. I just sat there, breathing slowly, letting their fury burn itself out while I held onto the only thing that mattered, my grandfather's decision and the handwritten letter that still smelled faintly of cedar and ink. Later that evening, when the echo of their outrage had faded into silence and I was finally alone in my apartment, I pulled the letter out and read it again, tracing the careful strokes of his handwriting, hearing his voice in my head as though he were reading it to me himself. It wasn't a long letter, just a page and a half, but it carried the kind of weight that didn't fade with time. He wrote about how proud he was of me, not just for the work I did, but for the way I carried myself through a world that often overlooked quiet strength. He wrote about how he'd watched me sacrifice sleep and time and money to help my students, how he saw something in me that reminded him of who he wished he had been in his own younger years. And then I remembered something else, something buried in the back of my mind until that moment came roaring back with a vividness that made me stop breathing. It was a dinner years ago, just him and me, sitting in that creaky sunroom at the old house with a bottle of cheap wine and a pie I had brought from the school bake sale. He had been quiet that evening, staring out the window at the garden like he was watching ghosts dance in the hedges. Then he turned to me and said, "I made a mistake with your father. I raised him to think that power mattered more than kindness, that wealth was proof of worth. And now I see it in your brother, too, chasing influence, never fulfillment. I don't want that cycle to repeat." At the time, I hadn't thought much of it. Just a nostalgic regret from an old man reflecting on the past. But now it sounded different. Now it sounded like a warning, a confession, and perhaps even a plan. He knew what he had created, and he wanted to course correct before it was too late. And I had been the quiet answer to that course correction all along. When I told a few of my coworkers about what had happened, about the inheritance and the eruption it caused, most of them blinked in disbelief. $2 million? One of them said, wide-eyed. You could retire tomorrow. Maybe I could have. Maybe I should have. But I didn't. I walked back into my classroom that Monday morning with the same lesson plans and the same stack of ungraded essays waiting on my desk. Because teaching wasn't just a job to me, it was something deeper, something that tethered me to a version of myself that no amount of money could replace. Still, the letter with the sealed envelope weighed heavy in my bag, taunting me with the curiosity of what else he might have left behind. So that night, after the students had gone and the building echoed with the soft hum of empty hallways, I sat at my desk beneath the fluorescent lights and carefully opened the envelope he had marked with 6 cryptic words, "The truth lies beneath the foundation." Quite literally. I froze, reading the sentence over and over again, each time feeling a deeper sense of confusion and awe. What foundation? What truth? Was it metaphorical, or had he really hidden something beneath the literal ground we stood on? I didn't know yet, but I did know one thing. Whatever my grandfather had buried, physically or figuratively, wasn't just a parting gift. It was a message, and I was the only one meant to find it. There's a peculiar silence that falls over a place once filled with so many layers of noise, not just the sound of voices and footsteps, but the subtle, invisible hum of legacy, the whispers of old arguments embedded in the wallpaper, the weight of expectations pressed into every creaking floorboard. That's what it felt like when I stepped back into my grandfather's house for the first time after the will reading, only now, it wasn't his house anymore. It was mine. The keys felt heavier in my hand than I expected, like they weren't just keys to doors and locks, but to questions I hadn't even known I needed answers to until that strange final letter he left me. I walked through each room slowly, letting the dust settle behind me, breathing in the scent of old wood, dried flowers, and faint cigar smoke that clung to the curtains even though no one had smoked in there for years. Everything looked the same. The faded armchair near the fireplace, the grandfather clock in the hallway that never quite kept the right time, the row of encyclopedias on the bookshelf he never used but never dared to remove. But something was different now. The house didn't feel like a museum of someone else's life anymore. It felt like a place waiting to be unearthed. And the words from that final letter echoed relentlessly in my mind with every step I took. The truth lies beneath the foundation, quite literally. I didn't know what he meant, not fully, but I knew him well enough to believe he wouldn't have written something like that lightly or metaphorically. Grandfather didn't deal in riddles for amusement. If he said something was beneath the foundation, then something damn well was. The question was where to begin. The cellar had already been cleared out, the crawl space under the stairs was empty, and the attic held nothing but old linens and holiday boxes that hadn't been opened in decades. It wasn't until I wandered into the garden shed, that rickety structure at the far end of the yard with a crooked door and a rusted latch, that I started to feel something shift. The shed hadn't been touched in years, maybe longer. Ivy curled around the windows, and cobwebs clung stubbornly to every corner. But something about the way the floor sloped, about how the planks near the back creaked differently beneath my boots, caught my attention. I dropped to my knees and began gently pulling at the floorboards, using the rusted claw end of an old hammer that hung from a peg on the wall. It didn't take long before I heard the hollow echo beneath the wood, the unmistakable sound of something hidden. What I found was an old chest, not ornate, not polished, just an unassuming wooden box with brass hinges and a tarnished latch. It wasn't locked, and when I opened it, the smell of aged paper and leather washed over me like a wave of memory. Inside were stacks of journals, folders filled with yellowed documents, envelopes with brittle corners, and photographs I'd never seen before, images of my grandfather as a young man, pictures of my father and Eric as children, even a few of me, sitting on his lap beneath the maple tree in the backyard. But beneath the nostalgia, there was something else, something far more disturbing and revealing. In one of the folders were copies of financial reports, but not just any reports. These were internal documents from the family's investments, marked with annotations in Eric's handwriting. I recognized the scrawl instantly, the way he always made his dollar signs sharp and heavy. And the numbers didn't lie. He had been falsifying projections, hiding losses, and quietly siphoning money from joint ventures my father had helped him build. It was systematic, it was calculated, and it was all meticulously recorded. There was no denying what it was, proof of embezzlement, deceit, and financial manipulation that stretched back nearly 6 years. And the most damning part was that these weren't copies my grandfather had stumbled upon. They were originals, labeled and indexed, like he had been collecting evidence in secret for years, waiting for someone to be brave enough or trustworthy enough to find it. I sat there on the shed floor, surrounded by the fragments of my family's carefully constructed illusion, trying to process what it meant. Not just for Eric, but for the version of our family I had grown up believing in, the one where Eric was the golden son, the pride of our father's legacy, and I was just the quiet teacher no one took seriously. My grandfather had seen through all of it, had known all along that Eric was building a kingdom of cards and lies, and he'd chosen me to uncover it. When I finally confronted my father, I expected anger, denial, maybe even a theatrical display of disbelief. But instead, he sat in stunned silence, staring at the documents with an expression that chilled me more than any outburst could have. He didn't argue. He didn't scream. He didn't ask me to explain or accuse me of forging anything. He just stared at the numbers, the signatures, the timeline, and then leaned back in his chair like something inside him had finally snapped. Maybe it was shame. Maybe it was the crushing weight of realizing that the son he had invested his entire identity in had been bleeding him dry behind his back. Or maybe it was something darker, the recognition that he had seen it too, deep down, and simply chose to ignore it because the truth would have meant admitting he'd been wrong. I left the documents with him, untouched, and walked out without saying another word. There was nothing left to say. Nothing that could undo what had already been done. And as I drove away from the house, my house now, the words from one of the journals kept echoing in my head, a line my grandfather had scribbled in the margins. The final piece of the puzzle is not for Claire. It's for Eric, let him face it. There was another letter, buried beneath the last journal, sealed in an envelope addressed not to me but to my brother. I hadn't opened it, not yet, but I knew I would. Because whatever was inside that envelope was going to be the final nail in the image he'd spent a lifetime polishing. And I wasn't sure whether it would destroy him or set him free. I had stared at that letter for days before I finally decided what to do with it, the sealed envelope addressed in my grandfather's careful, deliberate handwriting sitting on the edge of my desk like some heavy artifact of truth, waiting to shift the weight of everything one final time. It wasn't mine, not really, and though the temptation to open it burned through me more than once, I knew I wouldn't cross that line, not because I didn't want to see what he had written, but because I understood something deeper now. This wasn't a message meant for me. It was meant for my brother, and whether he was ready for it or not, he deserved to read the words that our grandfather had chosen to leave behind for him and him alone. When I called Eric and told him there was a letter, I kept my voice even and cold, not out of bitterness, but because I had no desire to coddle his ego or feed his hunger for drama. He showed up to the house later that afternoon, looking more worn than I'd ever seen him, his shirt untucked, dark circles under his eyes, that ever-present swagger absent from his walk. He didn't ask questions, didn't argue, didn't accuse. He just stood in the doorway and waited, and when I handed him the letter, he took it with a kind of hollow reverence that surprised me more than anything else he could have said. He didn't open it in front of me, and I didn't ask him to. He simply nodded once, stepped back outside, and walked toward his car. I watched him through the window as he sat in the driver's seat, turning the envelope over in his hands like it held a live wire, then finally breaking the seal. He read it slowly, deliberately, not with the speed of someone looking for a loophole or a final insult, but like he was trying to absorb every word before the weight of it crushed him completely. I couldn't see his face clearly through the windshield, but I saw the moment his shoulders dropped, the precise second when something inside him cracked in a way that couldn't be fixed with arrogance or denial. He didn't say goodbye when he drove away, didn't call or text later, and I didn't chase him. But I knew, in that silence, that whatever my grandfather had written had reached him in a way nothing else ever could. That night, I finally let myself read the last line of the letter, not because I peeked, but because I already knew what it would say. It was something my grandfather used to mutter to himself sometimes, especially when Eric walked into a room bragging about stock returns or business ventures. Money without integrity, he'd say under his breath, is rot in a silk suit. And that was it. That was the final message. Not revenge, not condemnation, just a simple truth that echoed louder than any fortune ever could. Months passed quietly after that. The house settled into a new rhythm, and so did I. I kept teaching, kept showing up for my students, grading essays under the same fluorescent lights, laughing at the same awkward jokes, and anchoring myself in the parts of life that had always mattered most, the small things, the steady things. The things that no inheritance could ever measure. But I also started something else, quietly, without ceremony or press releases. I established a scholarship fund in my grandfather's name, designed for kids like the ones I saw every day, kids who had potential but lacked opportunity, kids who didn't come from the right zip code or the right last name, kids who were told they weren't enough because they didn't shine loud enough. I didn't make a big deal out of it. I didn't put my name on the check or pose for pictures. I just funded the paperwork, built the structure, and let it do the work my grandfather would have been proud of. The first time I saw one of my students receive a grant from that fund, a soft-spoken girl who wrote poetry in the margins of her science notebook, I knew that was the real legacy he wanted. Not land, not stocks, not a surname wrapped in ego, but something that lived on in the lives we touched when no one else was watching. My father never came to visit. The only thing he offered was a single, cold email sent months later with nothing but one line, "I hope you're proud of what you've done." I didn't reply. I didn't need to. I let it sit in my inbox for a few days before deleting it without a second thought, not out of spite, but out of peace. Because I finally understood that his approval was never mine to win, and his disappointment no longer held any power over the life I had built. On the anniversary of my grandfather's passing, I drove out to the cemetery alone. The sky was overcast, the wind low and steady, and the path from the gate to his headstone was lined with yellow leaves beginning to curl at the edges. I stood there for a long time, just breathing, just remembering, and then I pulled one of his journals from my bag, the one with the final page I had read a dozen times since his death. I read those last lines aloud, my voice steady despite the ache in my throat. The world values noise, but it's the quiet ones who build foundations. As I turned to leave, I didn't feel triumphant or victorious or vindicated. I felt something simpler, something clearer, like I had finally laid something down that I'd been carrying since childhood, like I had finally stepped out of a shadow I hadn't even realized I'd been living in. I walked back to my car, the wind tugging softly at my coat, and as I sat behind the wheel, I looked back one last time toward the place where he rested. And I thought, not with certainty but with calm acceptance, I didn't ask for revenge, but maybe this was justice. Still, I don't know if I won. Maybe I just stopped losing.